So let's go ahead and jump into the second video that we're going to have for this section on America and the sort of rise of industrialization. For this section, I want us to really sort of hone in on the different types of experiences that might come with industrialization. So we're first going to spend some time talking about the shift to more factory labor and what that might look like. And then I also want us to think a little bit about some of these very wealthy billionaire tycoon types that are going to emerge over the course of the 18 and 1900s as a result of industrialization. So first and foremost, I think it's really important for us to understand the impact of these factories. For these factories, many of them are going to actually be built and will exist in places like Alamance, Guilford, and Rockingham counties. A lot of these factories are going to be cotton mills, textile plants, and one reason why they become so popular in the South, as we discussed in the last video, is because they have this new South system that is starting to emerge. So a lot of very wealthy investors from the North will come to the South to open and create factories. The reason they're going to do this is because, number one, the land is cheaper and the states are willing to give a lot of incentives to get these factories built. We can also see that there are a lot of natural resources available. And of course, there's a very available labor force. As far as labor, what's going to happen is that with the expansion of factories, you are going to see an increase in the number of children as well as the number of women in the South who are going to be working in these factories. As they start to work there, they are going to earn on average around 70 cents per day in the South, and that's compared to around $1.30 per day in the North. Now, don't get me wrong. What people are making in the North, also not a great wage for the time. Still very underpaid and very overworked. However, we can see here that it's almost a 50% decrease in the amount that would have to be spent on wages if someone was to open, say, a cotton mill or a textile factory in the South. As far as opening these mills in the South, some of them are going to be built in the earlier part of the 1800s. So, for example, the Alamance Cotton Mill was built in 1837 by E.M. Holt. But a lot of the mills that emerge also emerge a bit later. So we can see that for some, they are going to emerge a little bit closer to the 1900s. With this, we can see that one of the major sort of differences here is that industrial workers are going to lose a lot of their skills. In the past, if you wanted to purchase something like a pair of shoes or an item of clothing and you were going to buy it from someone nearby, that person would make your garment or your shoes from start to finish. They had pride in their craft. They had autonomy in their prices. However, as the factory system took over, it was now more standardized. So instead of going to someone and having them create a pair of winter boots for you, you could go to a store that would have a large selection of these boots in these standardized sizes. They are not custom built to fit you, but they are going to be far cheaper. With the factory system as well, people are not making goods from start to finish like they previously did. Instead, you start to see the rise of a system where people are going to only do one small part of the manufacturing process. So if you're putting the soles in the shoes, that's all you do. You don't worry about the laces or the leather or anything else. Because of this, people are going to face a loss of this sort of creativity and craftsmanship. We can also see that for a lot of workers, losing this ability to create for themselves is going to lead to an increase in drinking. It also leads to an increase in people having depression in the workforce. And of course, I think something that's also important is to look at who it is who's working in these different factories. So as far as this workforce. In the North, we can see that there are a lot of Southern and Eastern immigrants who are going to be moving to the United States in the 1890s. They are going to take a lot of the most dangerous jobs, a lot of the nastiest jobs, particularly in the North. We'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks when we get towards this progressive era and we start to see how people speak out against this as well. We can also see that for the South, a lot of women and a lot of African Americans also have to take on some of the less desired types of roles. Now, as far as women in industrial America, we can see that their roles really do start to change. For a lot of women, particularly in the South, they had previously had roles where they were in the home. They spent most of their days cooking, cleaning, tending to animals, taking care of children, and now they were expected to go and to work in industries such as the tobacco industry or with clothing production. And there's also within that even this sort of discrimination where oftentimes black women are excluded from the higher paying industrial jobs. This leads to a shift as far as dynamics of the family. Oftentimes we can see that women have to start working what becomes known as the second shift, which is where they work all day in these factories and then they have to go home and still complete a lot of the same labor that they would have previously been expected to do as well. Now with this, some people do of course argue that there is going to be an increase in opportunity for some women. So for example, there will be a rise in different types of office work that might be needed. So for middle class women, particularly younger and more unmarried women, they would be able to work in an office and they're aided by some of this new technology with typewriters and phones. And this could be a higher paying job and it might be one that is more prestigious. But again, these jobs are really only going to be open to women of a middle class who maybe have fathers who work as managers in factories or various industries who have the connections to help them get these jobs. But I think one thing that is important to note is that by 1900, women did make up around 17% of the workforce, many of them working in these factories. With the factories, it's also important for us to understand that there are a lot of issues that also emerge. So, for example, there are a lot of new diseases such as black and brown lung that are introduced because of work in factories and in mines. There are also a lot of very frequent accidents that take place. So very often young children, particularly young boys, would be used in coal mines. With coal mines, there's always going to be the sort of looming issue of whether or not these coal mines could explode. Could there be a fire? Could there be anything that could take place that could end up long-term hurting these children? And of course it does happen. As far as factories, children are very typically used. You can see here in this picture, this is in a textile factory. I believe in North Carolina. There were a lot of pictures of the North Carolina textile factories, but we can see that for these children, they are small. They have tiny fingers. They can get in little places that bigger fingers might not be able to. And there are a lot of children and a lot of reports of them being crushed by machines. There's some reports of young girls having their hair sort of taken in by the machines and just being completely sucked in after that because they are so small and the equipment is so large. And I think one thing that most people would face, regardless of the diseases and accidents, would be the excessive hours. People were forced to work between 12 and 14 hours per day. There were no 8-hour work days. If you got 30 minutes for lunch, you could consider yourself lucky at this point in time. And again, making very, very little per day. The compensation very, very low. Now, of course, that's not going to be the experience for everyone during this sort of industrial moment that the United States is having. Rather, we can see that people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller are going to have a very different experience. So up here I have the idea of vertical integration. And with that, we can see that business leaders like Andrew Carnegie, they are going to build networks of firms that are going to control all stages of production. Effectively, if you want to think about vertical integration and you can think about a straight line, what we're thinking about here is every single aspect of production for a company is going to be controlled in-house. That is going to help cut out any sort of middlemen. It reduces overhead cost, and it helps to really increase the efficiency of a company. So Carnegie Steel Company helps to exemplify this. He has his own coal mines, steel mills, and transportation network. So that means that he doesn't have to pay middlemen at any stage of this production. You also have industrialists like John D. Rockefeller. They are going to specialize in what is known as horizontal integration. For Rockefeller, this means that they either acquire or eliminate all of their competitors. Rockefeller was really well known for Standard Oil. And what he would do is he would go to other smaller oil companies in cities and he would basically asked them to join with Standard Oil to sell to him. If they chose not to do so, what he would do is he would go into the region, he would cut his oil prices so substantially that nobody could compete with him. Like, he's losing money at this point. But what happens is that once he dominates the industry, he will push the other company out of business. Then he can take control of that company. It'll be sold at a loss or it'll go bankrupt. He'll be able to purchase that company, and then he can raise the prices to be whatever it is that he wants them to be. So as far as Standard Oil, it controlled 80% or more of the oil industry in the United States by driving out all of the small competitors. Of course, we would probably think about this as being something close to a monopoly. And with this, we can see that eventually others will start to agree. So as far as what happens, again, we can see that for Rockefeller with Standard Oil, eventually the Supreme Court is going to make a ruling in Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad Company that grants corporations personhood that shields them from heavy government regulation. But by the time you get to 1890, you're going to have what is known as the Sherman Antitrust Act. This is going to curtail the sort of monopolistic practices that have taken place. The idea here is that they have to break the companies up. Now, does this necessarily happen? Not really. So for Rockefeller, what he does is he is going to create a trust and different types of holding companies. With this, what that means is that they are going to sort of break up Standard Oil, but he will still control everything. It'll have different names in different places, but he still controls the prices. He still controls the output. So just a way to sort of get around that particular type of system. Now, for many people, this, of course, doesn't make things very good. This type of system, you can see in this political cartoon, is going to be one that is very much pointed out by critics. Up here we have these sort of like robber barons of the Middle Ages, people that are taking from the poor, they're taking taxes, taking their food, have them in this system of servitude effectively. And then here we have these massive robber barons in the United States over the course of industrialization, and it's the same sort of idea here, where you have these men who they're basically giving everything they have into these robber barons who are taking control of industries and becoming more and more wealthy over time. We can also see that with industrialization, it does, of course, lead to some other negative consequences. So this is a picture that is supposed to represent like over the bridge in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we can see all of these smokestacks. To break this down just a little bit, of course, you are going to have these steamships, and with that, more steamships, more railroads using coal, that is going to put pollution into the air. And then even across this river over here, more factories also means more pollution. For the average person, however, we do see an increase in consumerism over the course of the 1900s. I have an example here of an Ivory soap ad. So their slogan here is, "It floats." And with that, we can see that many other companies will also start to print advertisements. In the past, advertisements have been very wordy. So you would see something that would like maybe go across your screen, or not your screen, across a newspaper, and it would say, buy Ivory soap. And then it would give you 2 or 3 long paragraphs about why you should buy Ivory soap. But for the common consumer, as they have less time to read, as there is going to be a decrease in some places in education, since more children are being forced to work in factories, they start using very quick, very catchy slogans. Things like, again, "It floats," which will be the Ivory soap slogan for many, many years. They use these pictures to encourage people to purchase their product. You will also see that different places, different companies like Sears and Roebuck, I'm sure you've heard of that before, become more popular as well. So for Sears and Roebuck, they are going to sell absolutely everything Now, when we think of Sears, we probably think of a business that has kind of gone under. In fact, I'm not sure if there are any Sears that still exist. If there are, they are very few and far between. But for Sears and Roebuck, you used to be able to order anything. And I mean absolutely anything from their catalogs. You could even order a house to be delivered to a lot, and then you would be responsible for putting it up. But these were actually very nice, very well-built homes that you can still buy today. Like, you'll still see some of them as they go up for sale. So here's like an example of what I'm talking about. So you have this is a 1908 version of a Sears and Roebuck house. You can see here you could purchase your home for, a little more than what is that, $2,000, completely builds and finishes this $3,000 10-room residence. Wouldn't that be lovely? But regardless, Sears used to sell absolutely everything. So we can see an increase in these catalogs and these books. With that, does that outweigh some of the more negative sides of industrialization? I can't say for sure, but I can say that, of course, for some people, maybe it did at the time. But anyway, that's all we've got for this section, and I will talk to you soon in the next section.